Our next two speakers are Melanie Martin, who was a postdoctoral associate in biological anthropology at Yale. She studies growth and nutrition among indigenous populations in Bolivia and Argentina and registered her most recent project on the Open Science Framework. Melanie holds a BA from the University of Puerto Rico and an MA and PhD from the UC Santa Barbara. She holds a certificate in college and university teaching and has taught courses in human variation, evolutionary medicine, and statistical methods for the behavioral sciences. Her co-presenter is Bret Beheim, is a senior researcher at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology. He studies cultural and technological change using both large-scale economic data sets and ethnographic fieldwork from small-scale societies. He has shared several research projects on GitHub. Professor Beheim holds a BS from Emory University and a PhD from the University of California at Los Angeles. Welcome, both of you.
There we go. Okay. Thank you to Michelle and the other organizers and presenters. I also want to thank our colleagues in the Yale department, Eduardo Fernandez-Duque, Margaret Corley, and Juan Pablo Pereira, who together with Bret, we've formed sort of a working group to discuss analytical methods in anthropology that have relevance to questions about transparency and reproducibility in observational research, which we'll both be talking about today. So to start off, I actually want to explain some of the research objectives in quantitative anthropology, because most people are familiar with anthropology as ethnographic studies of foreign cultures, which are very important and critical to current anthropology. But there are also many researchers who are studying cultural and biological processes in a systematic fashion, studying human and non-human primate evolution and behavior, and then, of course, fossil and archaeological remains from our ancestral and more recent past. And in studying these topics, we use theory and methods from a host of natural and social sciences, along with quantitative methods of data collection and analysis. So some of this research lends itself very easily to open, transparent, and reproducible methods. For example, a recent study published by Cody Ross, an anthropologist now at Max Planck, he examined evidence of racial bias and police shootings using a publicly available database of US police shootings that's actually crowdsourced and maintained by Deadspin. Some of the key findings of this study was that racial bias was more prevalent in certain large metropolitan areas, but wasn't really correlated with local crime rates. Instead, it seemed to be more predicted by higher income inequality in those areas. He also found that on average across counties, Black and unarmed Americans were 3.5 times as likely to be shot by police as white and unarmed Americans. So in addition to the importance of these findings, this is a wonderful illustration of open, reproducible research in anthropology, because not only does the data come from the raw data come from a publicly available database, but Ross also made available in the publication the cleaned and compiled data sets that he used in this study and all of his code for conducting the analysis. So that said, though, most quantitative anthropological research is still done by individual researchers or small groups of researchers working with data that they collect, often in small, remote populations. So an example of that would be a recent study from Brian Wood, an anthropologist here at Yale, and colleagues, who looked at physical activity and cardiovascular disease risk among Hadza hunter-gatherers in Tanzania. And what they found was that the Hadza are about 14 times as likely to spend their day engaged in moderate to vigorous physical activity as compared to same-aged US subjects. You can also see in this plot from that study, the blue line are males and the green line are females, that activity levels aren't lower with age. In fact, some of the older adults had relatively higher activity levels, which is not a trend that we typically see in the US. They also found in a separate study that across ages in the Hadza, we see a very low prevalence of hypertension and other biomarkers of cardiovascular disease risk, such as LDL cholesterol, high C-reactive protein, and high triglycerides. Similar results have been shown in other subsistence scale indigenous populations, and together contribute to our growing understanding that many of the chronic diseases that plague citizens in our country and other westernized nations, including cardiovascular disease risk, obesity, diabetes, and cancer, these are really diseases of modern civilization, and we just don't see them in populations that still engage in relatively ancestral behaviors with high activity levels and relatively low caloric intake. These are some pictures from the data collection in that study. So you can see subjects going about their daily lives, climbing trees to collect honey, digging for tubers, and just hanging out. And all of these subjects have heart rate monitors and GPS monitors strapped to them, which the researchers used to actually get the data about their physical activity. And I illustrate these really just to show that this data is really hard to get. Because first off, they're working in a remote area of Tanzania. This is also only possible because Dr. Wood and his colleagues have spent decades building trust and understanding with this population. And on top of that, they're collecting electronic and biomarker data in an area without electricity or internet or refrigeration. And then on top of all those logistical difficulties, if you have ever done field work, you know that in the field, everything goes wrong and nothing goes to plan, and you have to work from plan B, C, D, and change your original design concept multiple times. So for this reason, anthropological research really is often constrained to very small data sets or small populations with one-shot data collection that also has to be very flexible at the same time. So I think this raises questions for what transparent and reproducible research in anthropological and other field studies really is. So to examine that, we might start by first acknowledging what observational research can and can't do. So first off, really we don't usually have experimental controls because these may be impossible and often unethical. Second, even if you might be working with a small sample size, or actually the sample size is the entire population, in the case if you're working with an available skeletal sample. Also, often, many times, our populations are specific to a certain time and place, or it might be rapidly changing, which is happening with many subsistence level cultures like the Hadza. And in that sense, then, anthropological researchers, we can never resample our populations. And in that sense, our data can never be replicated. So secondly, we might really examine what the goals of observational research are, and this has been echoed earlier today too, in terms of acknowledging that very often we are exploring and describing unknown phenomena and generating new hypotheses from the patterns that we observe. At the same time, researchers might be testing existing hypotheses from existing theories, but using proxies in observational research rather than experimental controls. That said, even though we lack experimental controls to show pure causality, we are still interested in showing empirical support for these hypotheses and establishing robust associations, as these findings then can inform future research and policy in certain cases. Okay, so on top of acknowledging these challenges and goals that are sometimes specific to observational as opposed to experimental research, anthropology, as anybody who might be familiar with the history of Margaret Mead's research might know, there's a long history of questioning methods and transparency in anthropology. So thinking about all these things, we have tried to identify certain practices that might promote transparency and reproducibility in anthropology and other observational studies. So with that, I'm going to hand the talk over to my co-presenter, who is going to discuss some of these areas, again, that have been mentioned today in terms of identifying and using appropriate statistical methods for exploratory versus confirmatory analysis, and emphasizing reproducible methods rather than replicability of results through data management and sharing, registering analytical protocols, and then internal incentives to promote this behavior.
Yes, thank you. As Melanie described, in anthropology, to paraphrase Monty Python, every data point is precious. And often the information that we have about a particular site or historical location or particular group. Is that okay? Often the information we have is possibly the only information that will ever be known about that particular population. So we have a somewhat unique situation, but in anthropology, as in most of the physical and natural sciences, there's active interest in the open science and reproducibility movement that I think is kind of percolating up here. In terms of the statistical aspects of quantitative anthropology, there's a renewed interest in developing methodologies that are suited towards observational studies with small samples. And often this is predicated on the idea that the traditional methods in statistics were often developed in situations that we can't really apply to the kinds of analyses and data sets we're using. Often they were developed in the context, in the case of many frequentist statistics, in strict control treatment experimental studies where we have the ability to model exactly how the analysis is going to happen before the data is collected. In anthropological research, observational research in anthropology, often we forego the direct goal of establishing causality or treatment effects and focus instead on trying to establish reliable or robust associations between measurements. And there's also a small difference, but I think a very important one, between arguing that we're arguing for a causal mechanism as opposed to predicting particular phenomena without necessarily making direct claims about the causality. This is, of course, the same idea when it comes to Bayesian modeling techniques applied to predicting outcomes that oh God, I got to get both screen. Sorry. So much like election predictions and Moneyball, sorry, flashbacks, and the sort of the new wave of analyses that we see in social science. Often this takes on tools drawing from Bayesian approaches from information theory, machine learning methods, as described, for example, in Hastie, Tiptrani, and Friedman. These are all techniques which are coming in to anthropological analyses just as much as they are into other social sciences. One other aspect which comes up quite a bit with us, especially in anthropology, which we think maybe is worth talking the most about here, is the difference between exploratory and hypothesis-oriented research, or as the way that Brian Nozick put it yesterday in his talk, thinking about looking at something prospectively as an exploratory approach or as a justification, as scrutinizing an existing theory. And this is another great paper by Paul Rosen, which was written specifically for psychology, but I think is applicable to anthropology as well, as a justification for what we can call non-traditional types of papers, papers that are oriented around exploring data sets in a way that could be described negatively as data dredging or harking, which is hypothesizing after results known, both of which have been become relatively recently identified as serious problems behind the non-reproducibility plague that seems to be happening under our noses. But from an anthropological point of view, this is often all we can do. We don't have necessarily strong hypotheses coming into a particular field site or location, and we struggle with the framework of a strict hypothesis testing sort of idiom, simply because in many cases it's not appropriate, or the analysis itself motivates particular relationships between variables. So how to navigate that with the obvious problems with things like harking is something that I think is worth talking about more. I will mention one particular study that I was part of that came out this year because I thought that it had a relatively novel approach, at least in anthropology, to doing the data analysis in the presentation. And as Melanie mentioned, sometimes the reproducibility of the methods is possibly the best we can do because we're dealing with field populations or with historical or archaeological data which cannot be replicated. We cannot do another study from the same source and collect more data from that source. So this is a particular project that was spearheaded by Siobhan Madison at the University of New Mexico, collecting data on parental investment and decision-making in a minority group in southwest China. And the particular research question that she proposed was, is there evidence that women facultatively change their reproductive stopping behavior, that is the number of children that they will have, conditional on the current sex composition of their children that they have? So the way that we visualize the particular results of this model, we have two different sets of communities within this population, the Moso, southwest China. And these sort of honeycomb shapes here represent a sequence of birth decision-making, depending on the existing number of children and how many children are boys versus girls. So starting at the top of each one of the pyramids, we imagine a woman with no children having a probability of continuing reproduction, the probability of having another child, the parity progression ratio, as it's called in demography. In the orange pyramid starts at 93%, and in the blue pyramid, 88.9%. I'll explain what the colors mean in a second. And then conditional on having a particular child, either a boy or a girl, we move down the pyramid into one of the corresponding cells, and we have another stopping probability, or sorry, a continuation probability, the probability of continuing on to have another child. The stratification here between the patrilineal and the matrilineal is theoretically interesting in this particular study because we have reasons to think that groups where property and status and titles are inherited through the mother's line might have a different view of the marginal value of having another child if it's going to be a boy or a girl than on the matrilineal side of things. And in this particular society, we have both kinship systems taking place simultaneously in different villages in the same ethnic group. So there's a lot of similarities between the two, except for a very marked difference in their kinship systems. And indeed, we do see, as you can see by the colorations here, a relatively strong implication that women with two daughters in the patrilineal group have a much higher chance of continuing on and having a third child than in the matrilineal group having two daughters. So the reason that I mention this particular study is that we have the data and all of the materials, including the R code that this was done in R, available in GitHub, and the link is being down at the bottom there. And the sort of the paradigm that we're working here is using language from the open source software environment, which I think there's a lot of idiomatic similarities here. So this is a potential visualization of a research project done under a strict version control system, like using Git, for example. And I think there's a lot of similarities in this picture to what we saw during Brian's talk. Each of these nodes represents a particular snapshot of a project, continuing on from the initialization of the project all the way to publication or post-publication peer review, feedback on some kind of potentially, I don't know, Amazon comments type system, like we heard during Alan's talk. And the contention that I have here is that this kind of framework is, at least in terms of the laying out how a project might develop, is compelling for us as anthropologists because it implies, there's a sequence there's a chronological sequence that's stored that can be shared. This particular visualization here also has different branches that correspond to, we could imagine, branches that were willing to be made public, maybe the blue line at the top there, the master branch, and then other components during the development process that, for reasons of confidentiality or sensitivity, we don't have the ability to disclose, or we don't have as available for public release. And this is maybe the last point, that in anthropology in particular, it's very often the case that anthropologists see themselves not only as researchers for a particular population, but also as advocates for that population. There's usually a very large power difference between the groups that we work with and ourselves as researchers. And so that informs the way we look at data releases. And I can say, just speaking from my own ethnographic experience with anthropology, we generally are very much data hoarders. And part of the reason why is because we're afraid there's going to be unintended consequences of making too much information available about the groups we work with. So in that case, in this particular project with the MOSO, I felt that the solution, or the happy medium, was that we strictly had the variables and the data points that were used for the analysis available with nothing else, and to some extent scrambled so that they couldn't be used to match up to individual people without distorting any of the signals that were done during the data analysis. So with that, I think we should mention two things that sort of developments here that I think are very hopeful or insightful in anthropology. Mel is responsible for one of the first projects in the open source framework in anthropology, pre-registering an analysis she's doing right now on the agent menarche. And also, to again plug the badges, which is of course responsible from the other open source framework innovation here. This is something which anthropologists here at Yale have advocated for in the International Journal of Primatology. And you can see the citation here. So yeah, in conclusion, we think that there's a lot of scope for these ideas in anthropology, but there's some concerns or qualifications that are maybe unique to our particular field. And thank you.